Well, first, I want to welcome everyone and thank you for making some time to attend our webinar, maybe the 10th, maybe the 12th, 11th, or something like that. I started thinking about this webinar a while ago because we who are part of the thermal energy network community often mention the term feasibility study. Is that what needs to be done, or when should it be done? And it occurred to me that most of us, including myself at the time, had not really read through a feasibility study. And I thought of the seven, maybe, uh, uh, feasibility studies that came out of the Massachusetts Kickstart program, which was admitted by the nonprofit HEAT, Home Energy Efficiency Team. And among the best was the feasibility study done by our guests, Larry Lessard and Laura Diaz, for the church-driven, church-led thermal energy network proposal in Salem, Massachusetts. So I was really delighted when they agreed to uh, give a presentation, to do a deep dive into this particular feasibility study, and we'll, by extension, learn about other feasibility studies. So I'm not that great at reading bios of guests, but I would just say that these are two engineers with extensive experience. Larry for well over 35 years, Laura for 15 years or more. Uh, and I'm really, as I say, delighted to have them here. And so with that, I'll just turn things over to Larry Lessard and Laura Diaz.
Thank you. Larry, do you want to give any more background on yourself before we move on?
Um, sure. I'm a geologist, so calling me an engineer is kind of fighting words, but otherwise the introduction was great.
Yeah, I would ask
Awesome.
you, I would turn everybody's attention after this to the invitation, which had their full, some longer bios. And yes, I saw geology in places.
I make my living making fun of engineers, so I have to make that point. Except for Laura.
Dagger to the heart, Larry.
Um,
Um,
I don't know that do you need us to introduce ourselves more, or can we just proceed?
I think we're good. I was just going to say, just small background on Achieve Renewable, Larry's company, and B2Q, the company I work for. I think Larry's started to kind of talk about it being a geologist. Larry's in charge of the things that are in the ground, and I'm in charge of the things that are in the building. I think that's a good division of our labor.
Sounds like a good one.
So. All right. Well, thank you guys for joining us. So I just want to quickly highlight, there's a couple other players that are not here today that we'll touch on. So obviously the focal point being St. Peter's San Pedro, the Episcopal Church, as the anchor tenant of this potential network geothermal, and really the heart of the feasibility study as we kind of move into that. Um, San Pedro also worked with a company called Clean Energy Solutions. We'll touch very briefly on it, but they did a microgrid feasibility study around the same time we were doing the geothermal network feasibility. So we'll touch base on that just from a very high level. Some quick acknowledgements. You guys are welcome to go back and take a look at the PDF of the slides. But this was a large collaboration among a number of different participants. The church put together what they called their Heaven and Earth Committee. So heaven being the solar battery storage microgrid portion of their project, and then the earth obviously being the geothermal network system that we're going to discuss today. We had participants from City of Salem, as um, Peter mentioned. Heat was obviously heavily involved funding the study, and then we've had a number of other participants, but from community activists to Larissa Brown, who we worked with as part of this feasibility study to help with community engagement, and then a number of other people that were interested for their own personal and professional reasons. So just saying thanks to all those who helped in this effort. So learning objectives, our hope is touch on, what went into the technical feasibility studies. Like I said, we'll touch very briefly on the solar microgrid system that was looked at. And then obviously the meat of the presentation will be the networked geoexchange system. Other great lessons learned from either a municipality, a nonprofit standpoint, were kind of the financing mechanisms that are being taken into consideration as you're looking at a system like that. So touching on the grants potentially available, utility incentives, and then the investments needed to get this moving. We'll also talk about the community engagement, how we did that, who the strategic partners were, and then finally, key lessons learned, technical challenges that we encountered, um, partners, how to make a system like this work, and what kind of partnerships do you need, and then finally, decision making. So we'll start off with some project background, touch very briefly on that microgrid feasibility study, kind of get into the meat of our network geothermal feasibility study. We'll talk about some of the ongoing work. This is an ongoing project. It is continually changing and is continually, I guess, morphing into different versions. But it is very much an ongoing project. So we'll touch on that and what's happening currently, and then finally get into those lessons learned. So background, as Peter mentioned, so this is based in the city of Salem. It's a, relatively small city, 40,000 people, with a lot of historic characteristics that I'm sure many of us in New England are aware of. But it does present some interesting things to plan around when you're planning a project in Salem. Namely is how we work around the tourist season in Salem. So tourist season really runs most of the year at this point. But you've got peak tourist season in the fall. So you've got people visiting up to, like I said, 40,000 person city, and you can see close to 50,000 additional visitors September and October. And a few years ago, they peaked, I think, 1.8 million visitors in October with I want to say it was close to 100,000 people on Halloween. So it can make it a challenge as you're planning a project in Salem, making sure you're working around those schedules. And where this network geothermal system is potentially going to be located, or where it's being proposed, is in a very highly tourist trafficked area. So a lot of considerations as we were thinking through this. Background on the church itself. So the original church, not the original building, but the original church was founded in 1733. Many parts of the church are pretty historic, dating back to the 1800s, some additions in the, early 1920s as well. It's a growing church serving both the Latino and Anglo community in Salem. They represent a number and serve a number of residents in the Point neighborhood of Salem, which is a heavily low income neighborhood in Salem. They do a lot of different services and missions, providing laundry for, they have a laundry for love service, or sorry, program, emergency financial assistance, diaper drives, and more. And this is just, you know, this project that we've been discussing or will be discussing is really just an addition to their missions, being able to provide a resilient hub and a place for people to come to as this project moves forward. Show a picture of the church and then just kind of showing you guys where they are related or where they are in relation to the neighborhood that they serve most often. All right, so background, kind of what was the impetus for this network geothermal project? So as you can see, the church, this is their natural gas bills for 2022 through 2024. You can see this little blue natural gas usage. So the church has got an old steam hot water boiler that it's a sorry, hot I can't talk right now. Sorry, a steam natural gas boiler that serves the church. So you've got steam piping throughout the church. And at one point, National Grid, the utility in the area, came, knocked on the door, and said, "We're going to need to update the meter for your church, for the building. It's just reaching its end of life." And so they replaced it. And you can see from that 2021 up to 2022 in December, that bill didn't just double, it didn't triple. I mean, it just absolutely spiked. So they went from paying about $300 a month in natural gas in the winter to about $3,000 a month. The meter had been broken in their favor for a very long time. And so, as they were looking at their boiler system, it's coming to the end of its useful life. It's in heavy need of repairs at all times to keep it going. And so, the priest at the church started researching what are the most efficient heating systems he could put in his building. And he stumbled across geothermal and then realized that, oh, not only is a geothermal system extremely efficient, but a network geothermal system is even more efficient. And having those missions and services for the community in the area, he started thinking about what were the ways that he could bring a system like this not only to his building, but to his neighborhood and hopefully benefit the people in the area. So there's a number of people that he ended up reaching out to, the housing authority, multifamily buildings, and decided, like, let's move forward and let's get into this and see if this is something that we could actually make a reality. We'll get back to our geothermal feasibility in just a minute, but just wanted to say, as I mentioned, at the time they were also doing a microgrid feasibility, so kind of in the same vein, kind of thinking how could they be an asset to the community as well as increasing, the efficiency and decarbonizing their building. So one of the things that they studied at the same time was what can we do in terms of a solar system and a battery energy storage system at our church? The idea being if we could have solar on their roof, we could have solar on other community roofs or neighbors' roofs and create a microgrid in this area. The other benefit of the solar and battery storage system for the church itself, it also creates a resilience hub for the neighborhood. The church has been used in the past when they've needed a space for people to go. We've had some, work in the street. The City of Salem has asked the church, can they open their doors and let the church host them while people are displaced from their homes for, a few hours. And the long-term vision is, can they be a resilience hub for extreme weather events, or for other needs in the community, moving forward. So pairing that microgrid, kind of how do we take all of these systems offline and off the grid, combined with the geothermal system, is the long-term vision and something they are continuing to work towards. A lot of background information. Any questions at this point before we move on to the geothermal feasibility study itself?
Hey, Laura, this is Bernie. Did I see on the diagram that you had thermal storage? I saw you had battery energy storage.
So as of right now, there is no storage.
Okay,
This was again a feasibility study, so this is also still in a conceptual design process. It's not even, they haven't moved into any sort of design documentation, anything like that. This was from their feasibility study. What are the options that they could consider? Some of the things that they looked into was a battery energy storage system. This was done by another company. So this was done by the Clean Energy Solutions group that I mentioned at the very beginning. So not something Larry and I are quite as close with. But I do know we've done some additional work with them. The other thing that they were looking at was potentially some thermal energy storage. But as of right now, the thermal energy storage is not something that they're pursuing in the long term.
great. Thanks for the clarification.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
it potentially, thermal energy storage could be possible with the network system, depending on the arrangements of the geothermal borings and whether they're in one or multiple locations. So it's it's something that can be considered, but it's not part of the evaluation that we've conducted.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions? All right.
All right, great. I'll continue here for a little while. Laura had and Peter had mentioned the Kickstart Mass program that was funded by the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, and they had awarded administration of that grant process to Heat Home Energy Efficiency Team, and they were able to provide grants to 13 communities or 13 groups. And those grants were either $10,000 or $50,000. $10,000 grants were intended to be, a preliminary evaluation. The $50,000 grants were intended to be actual feasibility studies. You can't really do a feasibility study of the level that we have for $50,000. Both B2Q and Achieve donated a fair bit of time to the project because of the good works that St. Peter, San Pedro does, and because we wanted the evaluation to be successful. So there's a pretty wide variance in the level of detail in the different studies that were done, and we're proud of what we put out. Next slide, please. Laura, can you advance the slide? Thank you. So the original concept can be shown here. This is St. Peter, San Pedro, and you'll hear us discussing the Salem Housing Authority. They have 3 buildings in the ultimate area that we evaluated, but 2 of them are to the above the top of this image on St. Peter Street. And in this block formed by Federal Street and Church Street, St. Peter's, and this parking lot itself, there are a series of buildings, commercial buildings, residences, and the original concept was that we would seek ability to put geothermal borings under the parking lot and then return it to use as a parking lot, and that area can support about 150 geothermal borings, so it was able to support St. Peter's and these surrounding buildings. And there's a good mix of heating and cooling dominated building loads in this area. So Laura's boss, Paul Banks, was out on a site visit with me and just turned to me and said, well, if we can't do a thermal energy network here, you can't do it anywhere. So it turned out to be a pretty strong study area. However, and we can go to the next slide. 2 things happened that made that not the plan that we eventually evaluated. First, with outreach by Reverend Ives and Laura and my company, but really Reverend Ives is a force of nature, so he deserves most of the credit for the outreach. He identified 21 buildings where they were interested in participating, and these included the PBS Museum, which is a large internationally known museum facility, some tourist sites, residences, the low-income housing facilities, and all of that. Well, these 21 buildings have heating and cooling demands that exceed what we could do in this parking lot. At the same time, we were speaking with the City of Salem, who has been incredibly supportive of this project. And in fact, over here on the left of the image, we have City of Salem properties. That's City Hall there, and then the bottom left, that's a historic old Salem meeting hall. There's originally their seat of governance. This area has been developed since about 1630. But in talking to Salem, they expected to develop the parking lot. So they had not specific but general development plans. So it wasn't going to be feasible for us to install a ground heat exchanger there. But what they offered instead, in the upper right of the image, is the historic Salem Common, which has been a common since 1630. And they said, how about you just drill there instead? Well, that's great. It's a bigger area. and it can support a lot more buildings. So that's wonderful. It was a great offer. Now, we don't have a formal agreement to allow the installation of the ground heat exchanger there, but that's what the city has pointed to as an option, or at least at this point. So next slide, please. So when you take those 21 buildings and we draw out the area of the ground heat exchanger, which is shown in this blue color in the middle of the comment. And we didn't come to this configuration because we really wanted something that looked like Fenway Park. But we came to this configuration by avoiding the one or two buildings on the property and avoiding the crown space of the trees so that we wouldn't damage the trees during the installation. And we put forth one of what is many possible routes for the piping from the ground heat exchanger, which follows around, reaches all of those buildings, comes back, and it's about 6,600 feet of piping. There are other ways to do it, but this illustrated one option. Now, in studying the ground heat exchanger, we had an advantage that we already knew the nature of the rock, its formation, thermal conductivity, and diffusivity, and baseline temperatures. We knew that because my company has done formation thermal conductivity studies in the area, and because the city had a test boring and an FTC test at the old town hall, or the old town meeting house. So we had an advantage because putting in and doing a formation thermal conductivity test is, a $35,000 to $50,000 task. So we were able to avoid that because we already had the information, and that allowed us to do more than a conceptual, but a preliminary design of the ground heat exchanger, which we show on this next slide. This table summarizes what would be required from a drilling perspective, and we addressed 4 options to try to provide some additional clarity for the analysis. But if we did a traditional geothermal boring installation where the ground heat exchanger had 25% propylene glycol antifreeze and the bore depth was around 500 feet, we would need 450 borings, which fits within the area in the Salem Common. It's actually smaller than the area we identified as the easiest area to work. When you install a ground heat exchanger, the balance or the degree of imbalance of the heating and cooling demands on the ground loop has an impact on how much drilling you have to do. And we had an imbalance where there was more heat being removed than placed back into the loop. So we had the heating season more dominant than the cooling season during the course of the year for all 21 buildings when they're combined. So PBSX Museum has a lot of waste heat that they generate. So we looked at the idea of harvesting some of their waste heat and adding it to the ground loop and possibly making things better. Well, turns out it actually makes things worse in this particular case. And that's because ground heat exchanger sizing is calculated both based on the annual demands and the peak demands. And we would have heat that we could harvest from Peabody Essex during periods when the other buildings were also doing cooling. And so it made peaks worse, even though it balanced the load for the year, and it resulted in, a fraction more drilling required. It didn't give a reduction as desired. We also looked at using water, not antifreeze, because in Massachusetts there were a number of groups that were talking about ambient temperature loops, and had somehow conflated that with not having antifreeze. And if you don't use the antifreeze, then you're limited in the temperature swing within the ground loop, and you need to do about twice as much drilling. So clearly there's a big advantage to adding propylene glycol. Next slide, please. So based on the preliminary design with the piping layout that we had, the boring layout that we had, the amount of drilling and all of that, we worked with Arch Energy, which is a division of Consigli Construction, to do a high-level cost estimate. So this is for the thermal energy network infrastructure, not for the HVAC equipment that would be installed within the buildings. And that cost is around $55 million. Now, hearkening back to Laura's introduction, this assumes that we're only going to be able to work certain times of the year, then things have to be put back together for the tourist season and various other Salem specific requirements. And if someone were to look at this project without those optics, they could conclude that it could be done for less. But in Salem, this was our best estimate at the time. Now we think it probably is biased high a little bit, which is better than biasing low at this stage. But that installation was on the order of $55 million. Next slide, please. So we're taking another break for quick questions so that people don't have to hold their thoughts till the end. Anything I can clarify on what I just went through?
So on one of the, oh, go ahead, Bernie.
Thank you, Peter. I'll be very quick. Larry and Laura, you seem to cap the drilling depth at 500. Now, I know homeowners that have gone down way deeper than that, like 700 or 800 feet. Is that a thoughtful calculation as far as how did you come to that number?
Well, I will never say it wasn't thoughtful to any question I'm asked. It was. That's a standard drilling depth that balances providing enough heat exchange and minimizing the potential for a lot of water generation during drilling, because the control of water during drilling can be very expensive. Okay. It's absolutely true that you can drill deeper, and on a lot of larger commercial projects, drilling to 800 feet would be okay. When you do that, you're putting more water through each boring, or more antifreeze through each boring, and you have more pipe resistance. So there's a penalty relative to pumping, but it can make sense if properly designed. Additionally, the formation thermal conductivity test data we had went to 500 feet, so we were staying within what we knew. But absolutely, drilling deeper is possible, and that might end up being what happens. It's just not the way we calculated things here.
Appreciate that. That makes sense. Thank you.
Dan?
Yeah, thank you, Larry. You said that the grant was for $50,000, and it's a little bit hard for communities to kind of figure out how much such a feasibility study will really cost. So what is the what is the fair value of what you've done? And second part to the question, what are the costliest parts of the feasibility process? Is it the number of buildings involved? Is it the preliminary boring that, to get the thermal conductivity information? Um, I don't know, what goes into it. So we're thinking of a project that's considerably smaller, maybe four buildings or so. And, what kind of numbers should we be thinking of? Thank you.
All right, I'll start answering that, and then Laura can walk my comments back and add if I've gone astray. Um, the the market value of what we did is about 3 times the grant amount, so about $150,000. Um, the I can't really speak to what you should be planning on for the 4 building system that you're considering, because I have no context. I don't have information that would let me give you a thoughtful answer. But I know on this project, a lot of time was spent evaluating the buildings and their heating and cooling loads. And Laura had to do that for 21 structures, and that took a lot of additional time. And maybe Laura can speak to the detail of that.
Yeah, I don't know that I'll walk you back, Larry. I looked at the budget recently, and out of the B2Q alone spent over $130,000. So 150 is probably a little bit less than you'd want. I would say you'd probably want something for this number of buildings. I don't know, I was going to say closer, probably $200,000 at least.
I agree.
Um, so yeah, to Larry's right, the number of buildings, certainly is going to increase things, but there's some efficiency and, efficiency of scale. I created our calculate. We have a template for our calculation, and I'm repeating this over and over again. One of the biggest challenges that we ran into, and we'll talk about this, I think, a little bit later in terms of lessons learned, was Reverend Ives, like Larry has said, was just a force of nature and had all of these contacts and all these people. But then I had a whole bunch of people that I had to follow up with and collect information from. And these are not necessarily, you've got a priest knocking on your door and asking for your utility bills and can I look at your mechanical equipment? These people weren't prepped um, to have that discussion. So there was a lot of education that we were providing in terms of what is a geothermal system, what is a network geothermal system. Um, and then in addition to that, too, a lot of our commercial clients, we'll work with municipalities and they'll say do a feasibility study for 4 buildings, and I'm working with the city energy manager and they're giving me all of their data. The easiest people to work with on this project was the City of Salem. They are efficient. They had all of their information like put together. Here's all of my building information. Here are my drawings. Here's my utility data. But when I'm knocking on the door of the random office building and it's a guy who just owns one office building, I'm sitting in there scanning a bunch of utility bills. I'm looking at PDFs instead of a spreadsheet. So it was a little bit unique in that nature, but I do think depending on if you're, the nature of the building owner, their comfort in terms of talking about commercial building systems, it does change that narrative a little bit. We had a lot of, I would say, yeah, in general, just people who are not familiar with commercial mechanical systems. And so it was a very different conversation and a lot more hand-holding than I would say like our average commercial client. Um, so
Thank you. That's very
yeah,
useful.
yep.
And I have one question. I noticed in
Yep.
one of the slides a few slides ago, I saw the figure 85 degrees as maximum temperature. And is that what the temperature of the water coming out of the system into the buildings would be, or was it what you were projecting internal distribution of water? That's probably what it was.
That's a design parameter used in the software. We, when we're designing the ground heat exchanger, we give the software bounds that it has to work within. So in this case, we said don't let the water temperature get below 35, or the antifreeze temperature get below 35 degrees in the winter, and in the cooling season, don't let it rise above 85. So it's a theoretical maximum under peak load conditions that the temperature could get to that minimum or maximum. If we made that 90 degrees instead of 85, it would have reduced the amount of drilling, but there's an efficiency cost for that. So it's a first pass at what the entering water temperatures would be designed to be in worst case.
Great, thanks.
Yep. And that was something that Larry and I had discussions about too. We're looking at the specifications of, we were using some example equipment that Larry uses commonly in his projects, and then looking at heat pumps that we use in our projects, and just, you know, to Larry's point, where is that threshold of where does the decrease in efficiency, where do we, want to cap that off at? So.
Yeah, I have one other quick question, and I can see the time is moving on, so don't spend much. Somebody asked me recently, can you reuse existing gas pipes and repurpose them for water in a geothermal system? And I said, maybe if they were really new, but for the most part, these are older pipes and you would not want to do that. Is that the right answer?
It's part of the right answer. I think that the right answer is just no.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the reason for that is what you've stated, plus the gas piping diameter is much different than what we would
Yeah.
require, so it would be a limiting factor. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
so in some circumstances, sure, it's possible, but I think those circumstances are limited.
Great, thank you.
I would say,
I've got a quick piggyback question.
yeah.
Read in the report that the electric and gas utility did not respond to your mapping requests for underground infrastructure.
Mhm.
Did you have to throw a bunch of big contingencies in there, or is there a hostile situation here, or how do you see that going forward?
I'm sorry, you want to take that, Larry?
Well, sure, we'll do the same thing. I'll say something, then you can walk it back.
Great.
The I don't think it was a hostile situation. I think it is more likely to have been a security concern
Mhm.
with letting certain information be public. And yes, the excavation cost estimate paid attention to the fact that there was a lot of stuff we didn't know.
Thanks.
Yep. Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think the average person may not be aware. We get lectured all the time when we get people's utility data, that it is confidential. So, understanding where all of this piping and infrastructure is in the ground, that's just not something they're going to share with us, especially for a publicly shared report like this too. And the last thing I'll add on the utility side, they also, they've all got their own pilot projects going on. In terms of hostility, I think the last thing they want is another project on their list. So I think for right now, they're very happy to say, you guys do whatever you're doing over there, and if it becomes an issue, we'll figure it out then. All right.
All right, so a couple more slides with me regarding ongoing efforts. So you remember that St. Peter, San Pedro is now paying 10 times what they used to for heating. And they have looked at a variety of options that might help reduce that cost pending the installation of the network geothermal system. And that includes an on-site standalone geothermal system that's configured so it could connect to the network, or non-geothermal options such as air source or their hydronic boiler upgrades. Next slide. And the Heaven and Earth team has developed a series of committees to evaluate decision-making, funding, technical expertise, and continuing community engagement. Next. So there is ongoing community engagement with individual meetings and engagement with universities. Massachusetts Institute of Technology is involved. Salem State University's had, which is quite obviously located in Salem, has contributed. And those efforts are really focused at understanding community priorities and any challenges that are perceived. But I have to say that community engagement is not a limiting factor on this project. The community is engaged, the community is supportive. We don't need to convince anyone of anything. You know, people would like to move forward with this type of project. Next. The limiting factor currently is financing. And the church and the city have applied for and then been awarded certain grants that will support moving the project along further. But the funding currently isn't of the level that the construction could happen, but preliminary work, upgrades at the church, et cetera. And we hope soon more detailed design will be ongoing. And next slide. And this is going back to Laura now.
Yeah. So one of our other lessons learned, so as Larry mentioned, the community engagement and the community partnership has just been incredibly strong from the beginning with this project. But I think as you think about feasibility studies, something that is, especially for a network system, there's some really key pieces to flush out. Community partners, obviously, who are going to be the local people to advocate for this, get the community engaged, who needs to be included in discussions and decision making. But then some big ones, building and landowners. I think the biggest shift that we had was we had this idea of using the parking lot and then potentially some other land around these buildings. The church has offered up their parking lot, but you really need to think about, like, where are we siting this ground heat exchanger? Where is it going to go? We were fortunate that the city was so interested to continue the discussion. And we're kind of skipping ahead to the end here, but thinking about it from a city perspective, who needs to get brought into these conversations? What level do you need to go to? So we had a very involved partnership with the director of sustainability with City of Salem, who would bring decision-making needs up to the mayor as necessary. But the city was key in where can we put a ground heat exchanger. So those discussions have to happen early on. If you don't have a place to put that ground heat exchanger, you could have 10 buildings and no land, and it's a much more difficult conversation. And then the other piece here is, bringing in technical experts, making sure that you've got people on your team that can take these ideas and hopefully turn them into, apologies, and hopefully turn them into, a path forward. This has been an ongoing effort with the church and also some of the additional buildings. But it's, after we figure out where do we put this ground heat exchanger, the next question is, how do we build a system that's going to work for this building? What are the existing systems? How are we going to convert those systems? So making sure you're bringing in those technical experts is key. Other lessons learned is decision making. I think one of the things that we ran into kind of midway through this process, the Heaven and Earth Committee was a very engaged group, but it's also a very large group. And we ended up having a lot of discussion and great ideas. But big lesson learned, make sure you identify your decision makers early on. If you do not have someone in a decision making capacity or someone who has that power to take this next step, you're just going to end up talking to each other without kind of moving the project forward. So I think again, identifying those decision makers early on, and then understanding how do you keep the community engaged while also enabling the decision makers to carry it forward. Otherwise, yeah, like I said, early on we found we were just kind of chatting a lot, and we seemed to have taken this and as Larry said, there's ongoing work going in process right now, and it's a once this was recognized, there has been a definite difference in this project moving forward. All right, financing structure. So as Larry alluded to, and we talked about in terms of a feasibility study, um, this is a challenge, especially for a nonprofit, especially for small communities. Financing these are not a low investment project. Um, the church benefited from a couple different financing mechanisms. As Larry and I have mentioned, a lot of the work that we've done has really been pro bono. He's a very compelling client, and I think we're all very interested in seeing this continue forward. Um, but the very beginning process of this is very much a pro bono effort. So, kind of those team building, a lot of those site visits that we did early on, um, and then even just collecting the information needed to apply for all these grants. The church, the city, and then SESI, Clean Energy Solutions, have been extremely diligent in applying for every possible grant that they can that applies to this project. But a lot of those efforts were done pro bono. So, moving forward, once those grants were acquired, they have enabled these feasibility studies, deeper site analysis, looking at the building improvements and energy efficiency measures. And then we have kind of moved into this investment phase. So there's a couple different versions of projects going on right now. Like Larry said, we're taking a look at how do we just upgrade the systems in the church? How can we continue to support them as an anchor tenant, and enable them to be in a position if a network system moves forward? How do we set them up so that their systems are ready to connect with a network? Um, so they are in discussions with a couple different investment companies and how to potentially move this forward. They are also talking about a smaller network system right now with the church, the housing authority, and several of the multifamily buildings. So we're still, I would say, the investment is not there right now, but there are conversations being had as we move towards this investment phase of development and installation. Just a couple challenges. The church in particular has some challenges, but I think this can apply to a number of people. Obviously, the federal funding landscape is still uncertain right now. Geothermal incentives and the tax credits are still here, but something that is a constant changing landscape to be aware of. The other thing too is the incentive payback period projections, but this the incentive paybacks in general. Something that we discussed with the church a couple days ago is you've got to pay for all of this work up front, and then you get your incentive back, or then you get your tax credit back. So there's also challenges there, and how do we get enough funding to be able to complete the project, and then wait for those incentives to come later on. And then finally, the grant funding is just extremely competitive. They have applied to so many grants. And if we go back, these are the main grants that they have been awarded thus far. And this is only a small fraction of the number that they have applied for. So the grant landscape is extremely competitive. And you've got numerous projects that are also compelling, competing for these funds. So in conclusion, this has been we've had a lot of lessons learned coming out of this. It is continues to be a community-centric resilience plan. The church is already providing a lot of these services, and the goal is really to continue those services um, to the surrounding community. Like I said, strategic partnerships are incredibly important. As you've got, investors interested in this project, venues like this are so important to be able to kind of continue to spread the word, and kind of create those additional strategic partnerships, in addition to the ones that they already have. The other thing is innovative energy solutions. I mean, this started off with a priest who just was out there looking for the most energy efficient system he could, um, and kind of combining the network system, getting different people involved, looking at the microgrid system. We're going to take hopefully a building from the 1800s, and really apply some pretty innovative solutions, to continue that legacy moving forward. Lots of lessons in financing. This continues to be an ongoing challenge for us. Um, but hopefully there's some light at the end of the tunnel as we continue to move forward. And then finally, just continuing this ongoing engagement. So, like presentations like this, continuing to engage with our community, continuing to engage with all the university partners that have been doing outreach, has just been a key piece to keeping the project and the momentum moving forward. All righty.
Well, thank you very much. And that was great. And I have questions, but I'm going to open it up to other people first.
It looked like we had a couple questions come in. Want to start there or?
Sure. I wasn't looking at the chat, so
That's okay. I just saw them pop up. All
I,
right,
I,
let's.
I think that question might have been mine. I'm
Okay.
just sort of following up on Dan Rabin's question. I think
Yeah.
you said the city knew all about their buildings and they were easy for you guys to scope,
Yep.
and other people not so much. And so I was kind of quizzing you guys if there was like a spec list of information. So I know Dan is working with a lot of town buildings, but if people can do this and save you all time, we can just gather this information in the normal course of, running a building. So
Mhm. Yeah. So in terms of the typical information that we collect from the building side of things is like you had mentioned. So obviously building drawings, mechanical, electrical, plumbing drawings. If they have a control system, either access to the control system or the controls drawings to understand how that system is currently operating. Utility bills, whether that's, natural gas, steam, electric, just understanding what those utility costs are. Typically, we like to look back at least 3 to 5 years just to understand what the patterns are over time. That was one of the things we struggled with this project. There was a lot of people who just handed me 12 PDF utility bills. And so a year of data is just not an ideal way to size a system. Obviously, if you have a mild winter and that's the only information that I have, I could undersize your system. It's not an ideal way to do it. Having additional historic information is really valuable. Um, Anyone who is close to the systems in the building or just understands them is really helpful. You really do need to get on site to see these systems. One of the things that we saw when we did the housing authority walks was they've got a bunch of boilers and they're coming to the end of life. And that's honestly really exciting for us because if your boilers are coming to the end of life and you are considering how do I replace them, it's great to know that you don't want something. The problem is you've got the church, which has a failing boiler. You don't want that because now you're in a desperate situation. Like we don't want the building to not have heat. The housing authority building that we looked at, their boilers, I want to say were like 12, 15 years old, which is perfect. It gives us plenty of time to plan. It gives us plenty of time to say like, great, what can we get in here that can heat this building in a different way? So definitely getting on site, um, is, kind of a baseline requirement.
if,
Hmm.
Laura, if I could add one thing to what you said.
Yeah.
Like when you evaluate projects like this, it's all the cost
Yeah.
associated with what you're doing. But what you just put on the table was, let's just say one of the client buildings was going to have to invest $200,000 anyway
Yep.
in year one, two, three, four. it's worth putting that into the mix as well. And
Mhm.
I don't think I have not seen that done, but I think it should be done.
So the way we present a lot of our projects is a lot of times we'll do a delta in the cost. So try and show people here's what you'd consider, I don't know, an in-kind replacement. So if we're just replacing the boilers, it's going to cost you X number of dollars.
Okay.
To do the heat pumps, it's going to cost you this many more dollars. Because you start to look at just the whole number. And a lot more often than not, the heat pump replacement is going to be more costly. But if you start looking at the delta in the cost from what you have to replace anyway, and then you start looking at those energy efficiency savings, you start to have a more palatable investment.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yep.
I'd add to that it's important to keep a perspective with a long view on time.
Yeah,
If we,
excellent point.
the ground heat exchanger and circulation piping is going to have an expected lifespan of 100 years. So there may be buildings that today have newer equipment and don't want to make the change, but they could conceivably connect to the system later as long as there was enough available heat exchange. So what's going on now and how building efficiency trends and the impacts of terrible things like fires and such can impact who's connected to the ground heat exchanger and what their demands are.
Dan, do you?
Yeah. Following on that same point, what is the expected lifetime of a ground source heat pump for a medium-sized commercial building? And another question, when you say mechanical, that means HVAC system, correct?
Correct.
Yes.
Okay. Now the lifetime.
So for the mechanical equipment, so for the heat pumps in the building, we usually will say like 20 years. Would you agree, Larry?
Yeah, 20 to 25 in that
Correct.
range. Yeah.
It's a different, I mean, as Larry mentioned, I think he said it before, but then the ground heat exchanger, you're looking at, again, 100-year lifespan.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, I've got a comment. This is Rob Jorgensen. I've spent most of my career on college campuses, central steam systems and chilled water systems, and lately a lot of geothermal.
Yep.
As engineers, we can figure out the configuration of a system that will work for a given place. That's doable. People can figure out how much it's going to cost, how many $1 million.
Mhm.
But with these network systems, you're connecting into old buildings, new buildings, you're going across streets. The project they're all multi-year projects. And
Correct.
I'm seeing the big issue with financing. You need a financing organization or manager that's going to extend over basically a 10-year period.
Yep.
And you need so many $1 million every year for 10 years.
Yep.
And a lot of institutions, they can graph, we're going to spend a couple, so many $1 million a year for 2 or 3 years. But 10 years, that's beyond their concept. And that is one of the big issues that I see, is that these network systems are long-term and organizations are not really geared up to maintain an investment like this every year for 10 years. I see that as one of the big issues.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Reverend Ives and I presented at the HEAT conference last year, and that was one of the things that we were talking about is no one talks about the investment that was required to create the electric grid, or the investment required to put the natural gas piping in the ground. And that's essentially what we're doing, is we're recreating a lot of these systems that are in place now. But, we don't think about that because that was over 100 years ago and someone else had to deal with it. But now we're having to consider it again.
And in Massachusetts, the the investor-owned utilities have estimates of cost for gas system upgrades over the next 10 years, and I'm told they're budgeting $40 billion.
Right.
Wow.
So if you can put in a network geothermal system instead of however many $1 million of gas piping refit, then that may change the economics as well. But that would require legislation that's, not, or at least Department of Public Utilities policy that's not in place right now.
David, sorry to, oh, I'm sorry.
I was just gonna say, I think something to consider. I have a friend, she's the director of facilities at the Montana State University. And, they have been putting in geothermal systems since I want to say 2007. And they continue to put in small systems, and what they're doing now is they're connecting them. And I think that is something, as we're looking at this project in particular, we are looking at, okay, well, if the very least we do is provide a geothermal system for the church itself, let's make it a system that can connect into a larger system. And right now, there's also the discussion, like I said, between the church, the housing authority, and some of the multifamily buildings. What if we do a smaller system? And I think that is something to keep in mind, is like these are scalable. That I completely agree. It is, you're talking years of investment for, millions of dollars. But these can be scalable systems if that approach is thought of at the beginning.
David, sorry to make you wait.
So I've a above the ground question, which is probably a question for Laura. When you look at these buildings in the system, you probably see a variety of different mechanical equipment there. One thing that's probably pretty common is natural gas boilers with a hydronic system.
Mm-hmm.
Natural gas boilers produce pretty high temperatures.
Yes.
In, maybe 160, 180 or close to 200 degrees, I guess. Is that a challenge?
100%.
Replacing the boiler with heat pumps?
Mhm.
Absolutely.
What's the cost implications of that? And are there heat pumps that can even do that?
The short answer, it depends on who you ask. If you ask me, or if you're going to ask the heat pump manufacturer. You've got some heat pump manufacturers out there telling us they can do 180 degrees. The D rate as we get closer to that 180 is just so great that the answer is really no. No one is making 180 degree, 200 degree water right now. That technology has improved even in the last 5 years, but no, we can't make 180 degree water with air source heat pumps, geothermal heat pumps. This just, right now, that's not being considered. When we
So
are
you have
looking
to redesign the hydronic system to work
Correct.
with lower temperature water. What
Absolutely.
does that mean in terms of cost?
It's a large cost. I mean, you're ripping out piping because you're having to resize all of your piping. You're going from smaller pipes to larger pipes. You're typically designing for 140 degrees, is what we're calling low temp hot water. We were just doing this with a campus client, and you're pulling out the entire piping infrastructure in the building. If you want to keep a hydronic system, there's obviously other ways to do it. If you decide I'm not going to do, if we're already pulling out this is what a lot of clients are considering, is when we're pulling out the hydronic piping, why stick with hydronics? Why not, do a water to air heat pump, or look at something else, depending on what your needs are downstream. So without throwing a number on it, it's totally building dependent and how big your building is in your system. But I mean, it's very expensive, and it is very disruptive to tenants and very disruptive to the building to be able to do it.
Yeah, on our projects, because most commercial scale buildings are air conditioned, the geothermal system provides heating and cooling through an existing or modified ducting system.
Yeah.
Yep.
Can I just stop for 1 second and say that we're 7 minutes over? I love hearing these questions and answers, but I want to be sure that Laura and Larry, can you do another few minutes, or do you need to
Yeah.
go? Okay. Well, I don't see anybody else's hand up, so I'm going to ask a few questions. In in the in your in your cost and maybe financing uh, projections, most of the financing, how much did you give credit to revenue from customers? And did it ever come up maybe the city participating and maybe the idea of revenue bonds or something like that?
That was something in terms of revenue from like the geothermal system itself, in terms of like selling energy from it.
Yes, as selling the service of
Yeah.
heating and cooling customer buildings.
That was something we kind of didn't touch too much. It's
That was
um
beyond the scope of our study.
yeah, and it gets pretty complicated pretty quickly. Um, so we did not touch that in terms of our study and analysis.
Okay. And sort of along the same lines, have you been hearing much in the way of, or anything about companies that are doing energy as a service for individual geothermal buildings having any interest in putting their toe in the water of energy as a service through thermal networks?
Yes, and that's one of the companies that Reverend Ives is talking to right now, is discussing that and talking about building the system and then providing that energy as a service.
Right. The current discussions are really twofold. One would be putting in a standalone system at the church, and the second would be connecting to a smaller version of the network that we identified, perhaps a half dozen or fewer buildings, um, and possibly with the ability to do ground heat exchange at the parking lot that was not possible previously. So,
Okay, before I go on to Bernie, again, so what I'm taking away from this a little bit is that, particularly when you mention a small system, that may be a way to go in thinking about this. That even though you'd like to have a 20 building system, even initially, that having a 5 building system may be easier to start, and then you can add on to it sometimes easier than at other times, depending on, what's available. Do you think that that's a good way to think? Smaller beginning as a start?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think one of the things that gets lost when we talk about there's 21 buildings, I want to say, I can't remember off the top of my head exactly, but I want to say it was really 7 stakeholders. So what's lost a little bit is not all of these 21 buildings were 21 different owners. Peabody Essex Museum owns a lot of those buildings. The Peabody Essex Museum owned, I want to say, in that neighborhood, close to 30 buildings themselves. And then they provided us with a list of which buildings they would be interested in putting on a network system. So while 21 buildings can seem overwhelming, what we did try and limit was the number of stakeholders. So of the 21 buildings, three were with the housing authority. I want to say maybe 8 to 10 were with Peabody Essex Museum, two were with City of Salem. So I do think, limiting the number of buildings is one approach, but also limiting the number of stakeholders and decision makers is another approach too. So um, making sure that, yeah, I mean, just that's part of why he's looking at this with the housing authority is they've got 3 buildings plus his building. So we're looking at 4 buildings, but you only have 2 stakeholders. Um, and 2 decision makers to consider. So I think it's definitely a good approach. One of the other heat studies um, was City of Gloucester, and they're looking at doing 4 buildings, and that's moving forward. They're doing a test well, and they're looking at, how can we design a network system between these 4 buildings? It's a pretty different conversation. The city owns all 4 buildings. But again, I think limiting the number of buildings, but then also limiting the number of stakeholders is definitely key.
and the city of Gloucester has a really good team on
They have
their
a great team.
Bernie.
Peter, one of the things I hate working with you on is you make me think. You just made me think. Um, and Laura, I definitely heard that this is outside the scope, but right now there's a standard for all these 21 buildings. There's a standard run rate of utility costs And that
Mhm.
would consist of electricity and whatever fuel that they're burning.
Yep.
So however you want to construct it, say there's a run rate utility cost now, and then you all provide this service, and you provide essentially hot water. The delta, to go back to your sort of calculation, should include, I think, some contribution from all those people. Like presumably, Reverend Ives, for example, will benefit. His monthly utility costs will go down, but probably not. He should bear some of the costs of this system. And so I think, Peter, what you identified is probably a big but complicated resource to this financing puzzle, namely, how much are the users going to pay for this service? And I hadn't thought of that before you mentioned it, so
Okay,
but thanks.
sure. Dan,
So knowing what you know, when will the shovels go in the ground in Salem? And when will it be finished?
yeah, I'm going to a prediction market after this, so put your best information in.
Geothermal projects are slow projects to begin with, especially if you're looking at a scale like this. I mean, I think before you could have anything, I don't know, Larry, what's your thought? I'm thinking shovels in the ground wouldn't be for another, what, 2 years
Yeah, I think at best 2 years.
at best. And it depends on what version we're talking about. For the 21 buildings, I think, something that's ongoing is MIT is working on community engagement right now. And one of the things that came out of their community engagement is you have a bunch of homeowners and commercial building owners around the commons and said, wait, why weren't we included in this study? And it was really because it just started getting out of hand. I mean, we couldn't keep talking to people. But I think, if we're talking realistically and we're just looking at these three stakeholders for a version, I mean, I think you could potentially have a very small network compared to what we proposed online in 5, 8 years. That's my guess.
I think Reverend Ives would like to have the standalone system start this year, but maybe
Yeah.
it would be next year. And then in parallel with that, maybe development of the smaller version of the network. And I could see that possibly starting in 2 or 3 years as Laura indicated. And I think that having geothermal at the church will be an anchor that would show a lot of more towards the feasibility of the smaller version of the network. But I think the full version that we show here probably will never be installed as it's drawn because there is more interest now than there was when we identified those 21 buildings. So what gets built on a larger scale will potentially be more than the buildings we identified.
Bernie, I'm going to ask you for the next question, which I think should be the last question out of consideration for time.
Thank you so much, Peter. And this is more a comment. I mean, this has been a great presentation, but I have to confess that my big takeaway is as follows, that if you have a broken gas meter, don't fix it. And if you have a working gas meter, go out of your way to break it. And we can avoid all this work.
That doesn't take
I have a
into
quick
account,
question.
that
I
doesn't
got
take into account greenhouse gas emissions, but otherwise correct.
Or the fact that his piping system is failing inside of the building.
Don't think about
Sorry,
that.
Mark.
yeah, I've got a quick question. Just going forward, we're now in post feasibility. You've got the 4 committees. How does the leadership and organization and decision making work there? Are you two folks the advisors to the Reverend and he makes the decisions, or is there more of a technical engineering lead taking over?
Right now, it's Larry and I providing, our consulting opinions to Reverend Ives.
To the Reverend. And if
Yes.
these committees come up with different ideas, you broker those ideas with the Reverend, right?
Right now, the committees are not coming up with additional ideas.
Okay.
Yep.
Got it.
Yep. So one of the studies we did an HVAC option study after this feasibility study specifically focused on the church, and out of that came the decision to try and move forward with an individual geothermal system for the church.
Got it.
So that is the plan that they are taking forward right now
Got it.
as financing is available.
Okay. Well, that was a fantastic presentation, and I appreciate your staying longer for the many questions, and I thank everybody for their excellent questions. And even more than that, what you're doing, what the two of you have been doing in working with Reverend Ives is just amazing work. And I, I guess I want to thank you for that and appreciate it. Um, as we try to do our work here in Connecticut to move the geothermal and the geothermal network idea forward. So in any case, I'll stop there. And Larry, I promise never to call you an engineer again.
Well, that's great. Thanks.
Okay. Well, again, thank you very much. And thanks everyone for attending. We'll see you all
Thank
later.
you.
Bye-bye.